The dirt under his fingernails cracked and bled as he clawed at the ground. His lips were split from the dry air, skin sunburnt and peeling. The desert heat pushed in waves, and every moment felt like lifting stone. John King's breath came in shallow bursts. Around him, the camp was silent. No voices, no footprints, just a tree, gnarled and weathered, with the message carved deep into its bark. Dig 3 feet northwest, April 21st, 1861. This had been the camp, the place they were supposed to find men, supplies, and a way home. A lifeline, but now it was abandoned. They dug with blistered hands, sand sticking to the sweat on their skin, until they hit something solid. A cache. Inside it was a bit of flour, rice, and a note. The man holding it said nothing at first, just stared, and then, in a hoarse whisper, he read it aloud. The support team had waited here for months, but too much time had passed, and they'd left that very morning. They had only missed them by a few hours. And it wasn't the first failure, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, because before this, before the final bitter twist, there had been other signs. A wagon breaking in the streets of Melbourne, rain-slicked roads, a man injured before they even reached the outback. Moments that seemed small, but they were warning shots all the same. Who were these men? What were they chasing? And how did a continent-wide expedition, backed by the finest minds and money of Melbourne, turn into a fight for survival in the middle of nowhere? This is the story of the Burke and Wills expedition, a journey that began with cheers and ended in silence. Stick with me, because by the end, you're going to see just how close these men were to making it out alive. When John King left Melbourne, he wasn't just one man in a line of nearly 20. He was a camel handler, a quiet soldier. He wasn't in charge of anything. He was just doing his job, simply following orders and keeping pace. He couldn't have known what was coming. None of them could. It was supposed to be the greatest expedition in Australian history. No European had ever crossed the continent, not from ocean to ocean. Their goal was to travel from Melbourne, at the edge of the southern coast, all the way to the Gulf of Carpentaria in the far north. More than 3,200 kilometers of unknown terrain, and then they were to return safely. The journey was expected to take 6 to 8 months. With the supplies they carried, they were prepared for a long, calculated march. But trouble found them before they even cleared the city limits. In August of 1860, the city of Melbourne came to a standstill. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, over 15,000 people flooded the streets to cheer the departure. The line of wagons stretched nearly a kilometer. Camels from India, horses, crates stacked high, and even rockets. All in all, it was about 20 tons of supply. It looked unstoppable. And at the front rode Robert O'Hara Burke, Irish-born, headstrong, and untested. A former police superintendent with no exploration experience, but no shortage of confidence. His second in command was a person named Landell. But that would change early into the journey, and we're going to get into that. Within the first day of the journey, a wagon literally collapsed in the middle of the road. Another got stuck in deep mud. One person broke their leg, and another was nearly swept away by floodwaters. Their gear was just too heavy. The animals slowed, and progress dragged on. It said that Burke even refused to let some of the slower individuals ride the horses in hopes they would quit and they could speed up their progress. By the time they reached the edge of the outback, they were already more than a month behind schedule. Tempers would flare, and Burke clashed out with his camel master Landell's over command decisions and the handling of animals. The argument ended with Landell's resigning and the expedition's only doctor walking out with him. At this time, a person named William John Wills is appointed as the second in command. It said that he's quieter, more scientific, and very precise. So Wills stepped up and filled the gap, promoted quietly without any ceremony. None of these hardships stopped Burke, and at this point they made it to an outpost called Minandee. They still weren't even halfway to the Gulf. It's then that he made a call that would define the entire expedition. He split the group. He would set up a supply camp at Minandee, which would remain behind with most of the men, animals, and equipment, while Burke would lead a small advance party of 8 men. His hope was that cutting the gear carried would force a faster pace. And the men didn't wait around long before they left, and they journeyed north until mid-December. Here they established a second supply depot along the banks of Cooper Creek, a dry remote channel system near the edge of the known map. It became their final staging point. chosen so that the rest of the team could wait in relative safety while Burke attempted to reach the Gulf with a smaller, faster party. The idea was simple: travel light, move quickly, and return before the summer heat closed in. A person named William Braw would remain behind in charge of that camp, while Burke led the small advance party now of only 4 men, a few camels, and only 3 months of rations. They would try to reach the Gulf of Carpentaria in as little time as possible. Before his departure, he left clear instructions to wait 3 months before packing up and returning home. They believed they could make it to the coast in just a matter of weeks, returning back to Cooper Creek before the heat and wet season of the summer arrived. But in reality, it was already late October, and the worst of their decisions was yet to come. The moment they left Cooper Creek, they entered another world. They moved with urgency, believing speed would be their salvation. But with each mile, the landscape fought back. Somewhere near the Grey Range, they were assisted briefly by a group of Yandruwanda people, local indigenous, who showed them where to find water and pointed them towards viable bush tracks. But Burke didn't linger. He was obsessed with reaching the North Coast before the worst of the wet season. Whether it was the heat or the wet weather, all they knew is they had to make it back to safety. The guidance from the indigenous people helped, but it only bought them time. Unfortunately, time was never on these guys' side, and their journey took much longer than expected. And by late January, well into the start of summer and the wet season, they passed into what's now Western Queensland, following the Diamantia and Little Bino rivers toward the Gulf of Carpentaria. And unfortunately, rains from the monsoon season had flooded the land, forming vast and wide green corridors. But for the first time in weeks, though, they were able to seek shade, so it was a little break from the absolute torture they were going through. Here, they were less than 30 kilometers from the ocean, but the dense, soggy mangroves in front of them blocked their way. The land became a maze of saltwater creeks and waist-deep muck. Camels couldn't pass, even on foot. The air was thick with biting insects and the stench of decay. Wills attempted several scouting trips, but the mangroves were just impassable. They were so close to the Gulf, it was said that they could actually smell the open water. But unfortunately, for them, being close is the best they could do. At this point, they make the call that the crossing is complete. Even though they technically didn't make it coast to coast, it was all they could do. And on February 13th, they decided to turn around. Now, the return march began. And by this time, the terrain was drier. The water holes that had carried them north were gone, and one by one, the camels would begin to collapse. They had to be shot for food and abandoned where they fell. The group started rationing everything: flour, tea, and sugar. They even chewed leather and sucked on tree roots. And when they couldn't move fast enough, there was times where they went without food entirely. And by late March, the weight of it all began to show, especially in Charles Gray. He was the strongest man among them, but he had started lagging behind. One morning, King and Wills caught him stealing flour. It wasn't much, just a pinch. But Burke reacted with fury. He beat Gray on the spot. It was one of the most brutal moments, and a turning one. Over the next few weeks, Gray's health would collapse. Gray had been ill for weeks, severely weakened and showing signs of dysentery, including bloody diarrhea, extreme fatigue, and weight loss. Eventually, he would cough blood, his legs would give out, and on April 17th, just days from their destination at Cooper Creek, Charles Gray died in the sand. He was buried in silence, no eulogy, no marker, just a shallow grave and a moment to gather what strength they had left. Then, they kept walking. Cooper Creek was still out there, and they had no idea what they would find when they got there. The 3 remaining men didn't speak for a long time. The silence between them was heavy, more than exhaustion. It was the realization that they might not make it. Their bodies were essentially breaking down. Wills wrote that even lifting a pot to boil tea left his arms trembling. Their gums bled, their legs gave out. They were no longer just hungry, they were in full collapse from starvation and exposure. Burke's team had carried only enough ration for 3 months. That was if everything went right. And at this point, they had been gone almost 4 months. They had gambled on speed, believing that they'd be back before starvation was ever a threat. But that plan had long since collapsed. And by the time they reached Cooper Creek on April 21st, they were skeletal. barely moving, but they were alive. And unfortunately for them, they were too late. Their salvation and the men that they were supposed to find with supplies were gone. Bra had left. The camp was abandoned. The only trace of life was a carved message on a tree near their old shelter, and it read, "Dig 3 feet northwest, April 21st, 1861. The men desperately clawed at the ground with blistered hands and found a small cache with flour, rice, and dried goods. There was a note left by William Bra. It said that he had waited 18 weeks and had left that very morning only 9 hours earlier. Can you believe that? Hours away from salvation, and it slipped just out of their fingers. Burke had implicitly instructed Bra to wait 3 months, but Bra had waited 4, long past the expected return. With no sign of the advance party and his own men weakened by illness, there was no way to know what had become with them. They had clearly made the assumption that Burke and the party had perished. At that point, he made the choice to withdraw, leaving the cache behind just in case he was wrong. I can't imagine the cruelty of being so close, like hours away from that crew. But it just seemed for these guys like death was just hanging in the air all around them. And Burke would go on to record in his journal,
"I hope we shall be done justice by. We fulfilled our task, but we were no followed up as I expected, and the depot party abandoned their post."
This is actually Robert O'Hara Burke's final note, dated June 26, 1861. This note's a little one-sided because Bra had actually waited longer than he was supposed to. But I understand Burke's desperation and anger in the situation. He definitely understands they're basically doomed. All right, I really hope you guys are enjoying this episode. If you have a moment, consider subscribing to the channel or liking or disliking this video. It lets me know what kind of content to create. Not to mention, it helps make me feel like I'm not out in the cold and starving to death. Other than that, I'm not going to waste your time, so let's move on. Now, the men stayed at Cooper Creek for days, trying to recover as much as they could, camping in the makeshift gunya, a low hut of branches and bark tucked near the creek. Now, when you think creek, this isn't a typical creek. It's basically got dry spots and wet spots, and it's very seasonal. So it was able to provide them with a little bit of water, enough to survive, but just barely. It's here though, at Cooper Creek, they tried to decide their next move. Wills wanted to follow the trail back south, the known path, however long. Burke disagreed. He didn't think they'd either be able to reach the Mindy camp in time, and they were too weak to try and catch up with Bra's crew. Burke believed their only hope was a more direct shot west, toward the remote cattle outpost at Mount Hopeless. Now, Mount Hopeless was a lonely station on the edge of the interior, one of the last settled places in South Australia. Burke thought it was closer than retracing their steps back to Mindy. But the name said it all. The land was dry, flat, and deadly, and they were already near collapse. The decision split them, but in the end, everyone decided to follow Burke. Now, before they left, Wills gathered his journals, notes, and observations, nearly 6 months of careful records, and he buried them in a hidden cache. Wills was careful to make sure that the site was left completely undisturbed, making the fateful decision to leave no sign that they had returned here, because he didn't want some stray wanderer to come by and see that there was a cache and dig up his journals and records. It was an act of protection, but unfortunately, it was an act that would seal their fate. Because unbeknownst to them, somebody did come looking. And on May 8th, Bra returned, this time with somebody named William Wright, the officer who was in charge of the camp and supply party at Mindy. They rode into the clearing, checked the dig tree cache, and saw nothing unusual. Unbeknownst to them, the buried journal with Will's messages and notes lay just a few feet away, untouched. Now, Bra and William Wright only stayed about 15 minutes. Essentially, they assumed everything was completely untouched, including the food that they left behind, because Wills was so careful to cover his tracks and protect his journal and notes, basically kind of left it as he found it. And now, with nothing to indicate that the men had returned, Bra made the fateful choice to head back to Mindy, where he sent word to Victoria reporting the presumed loss of Burke and the party. It was the second missed chance to be rescued. And unbeknownst to Bra, Burke, Wills, and King were still alive, though barely, and already on the move, pushing southwest, through blistering heat, doing everything they could to reach Mount Hopeless. At this point, though, their last camel was dead, all the water holes had dried up, and the desert was closing in. None of them knew if they could make it, and their only remaining hope was that somehow the Yandrawanda might find them again. The people that had gave them a little bit of salvation before, they knew they were still out there, they knew they were friendly, and they clung to the hope that they might just find them again. They had no choice but to keep walking. Sometimes they would follow the old creek bed, trying to find little bits of water. Other times they would cross endless plains and cracked earth that shimmered in the heat like broken glass. The flies, it was said, never left them, and they were too weak to swat them away. What little they held onto, which was only a billy can, a rifle, and one of Will's watches, all became dead weight and had to be left. And after several days, it started to become abundantly clear that Wills wasn't going to make it. They'd only covered a fraction of the distance to Mount Hopeless, and he could barely lift his legs. He told Burke and King to leave him behind, to keep moving while they still had enough strength. They give him nardu, which is a porridge made from a seed, water, and a bit of shade. Then they walked away. Wills never moved from that spot again. Burke and King would push on, veering slightly west. The sun never let up. Their limbs felt hollow. They tried to follow birds when they could, hoping it would lead them to water, food, or shelter. But Burke was fading too. He began falling behind. It had been 3 days since they left Cooper Creek, and it's here that he collapses out a waterhole. When King offers to go and find help, Burke refused. It said that his last words were, "I hope you will remain with me till I die, but I thank you if you cannot." He died sometime during the night. King buried him with leaves and dirt, barely able to lift a handful at a time. Now alone, John King drifted along the banks of a dry creek, half conscious, with no food, no plan, and no direction. He wasn't walking out of the desert, he was fading into it. And a few days would pass, and in a stroke of absolute luck, the Yandrawanda found him again. They had helped these white men before, bringing fish, nardu, and water to their camp. And now seeing King alone, they knew what had happened. He was skeletal and near death. They carried him into a bark shelter, wrapped him in possum skins, and did everything they could to keep him alive. All they could do was lay there while they fed him by hand. They stayed there and sat with him and protected him. Wills was gone, Burke was gone, the expedition shattered. But somehow, King had been found. John King, at this point, had no idea if anyone was looking. For nearly 2 months, he lived among the Yandrawanda, half dead, sunburnt, and gaunt. Couldn't speak their language, and they couldn't speak his. But that didn't matter because they kept him alive. And meanwhile, the rest of the expedition, the men stationed further south, had finally made it back to Minandee. And here Bra is able to send word to Victoria, as I mentioned earlier, that Burke and their party had perished. But when word got back to Melbourne, the response was immediate, and the exploration committee that had organized this trip in the first place launched a full-scale recovery effort. It was led by Alfred Howitt, who was experienced, calm, and capable. He set out in late June with orders to find survivors if possible, and bodies if not. And in September of 1861, Howitt and his team finally arrived at Cooper Creek. They expected to find graves, but what they found instead was a clue. They encountered members of the Yandrawanda who told them that a white man had been living nearby, half-starved, wrapped in possum skins, and too weak to stand. The tribe led Howitt to King. He was stunned, barely able to speak, but he was alive. He was the last survivor of the advance party of the Burke and Wills expedition. And with King's help, they were able to locate the shallow graves of both Burke and Wills. Eventually, they recovered the hidden second cache back at the tree, including Will's final notes, still buried exactly where he left them. It was all there. Every page, every note, every missed chance. From the journal entries, it became clear. They had survived the trek to the coast, but missed their only chance of survival at Cooper Creek. They made the fateful choice to also choose Mount Hopeless over Minandee. And if they had headed south, they would have crossed paths with Bra. They made the fateful decision to bury Will's journals and hide them so that nobody would know they were there, hiding any clues that they actually made it back to the cache, resulting in Bra leaving and heading south thinking they were dead. And King, he would return to Melbourne in November. The city that had once cheered at their departure now stood in silence. said that thousands gathered at the docks to see him disembark. He was the only one to return from the desert. The story of Burke and Wills didn't just end in tragedy, it left a lot of questions, because this really is one confounding disaster after one. Things like why they assumed it would take him only weeks to trek to the coast. Why did he try and hide what was buried beneath the tree, covering up the only chance Bra had at finding him? If Bra had waited one more day, what then? Now, what if Wright, on their second trek back to Cooper Creek, had found the stuff that Wills had left behind? They would have known they were there and settled after them. But unfortunately, close just isn't good enough. And that seemed to be the theme of this tragedy. Whether it was so close to rescue or so close to the ocean at the end of their journey, everything in front of them just seemed out of reach. They missed rescue twice, once by only hours, and once because of a single undisturbed patch of sand. It said that Burke's leadership was always bold, but it was impulsive. He had no background in exploration, he distrusted caution, and he split the party repeatedly, abandoning supplies to move faster and dismiss those who questioned them. He made assumptions like reaching the coast in weeks, being able to beat the seasons. By contrast, when people would read Wills' journals, it showed a man who was quietly aware of how bad things had become, but still he followed his leader. And in one entry he wrote,
"We are on the point of starvation, not so much from the absolute want of food, but from the want of nutriment in what we can get."
Now, what that means is that they were filling their stomachs with nardoo and leather, but starving all the time. So he's abundantly aware that they were in a very, very dangerous way. But all these questions, at the end of the day, are just questions. There is no answers because these guys were clearly starving. They had been exposed to the elements and none of them were really thinking clearly, but it definitely seems they were aware of how bad things were. Following the expedition, Burke and Wills were buried with honor. A public funeral was held in Melbourne in 1863. It said that tens of thousands lined the streets, and the remains were carried in state with black horses and velvet drapes, a nation mourning two explorers it had once sent off with cheers. The Burke and Wills expedition set out to conquer the continent, but it wasn't the land that defeated them. It was time, lost in hesitation, heat, and 9 silent hours under a tree. And in the end, only one man came back to tell the story. John King didn't survive because he was the strongest. He survived because he listened, he waited, and he adapted. He certainly was the luckiest among them. And today the dig tree still stands. Its bark covered with the same fateful message, dig 3 feet northwest, April 21, 1861. It doesn't mark a grave, it marks a moment almost like a warning etched into wood about how close we can come to surviving and still fall short. Mother Nature just doesn't care about you, but I do. I really hope you guys did enjoy this story. It really stuck with me. I've never been to Australia and I still don't know if I want to go. I'm pretty scared. It's super hot and there's a lot of poisonous stuff. I don't know if there's any Australians on here, let me know. Tell me if it's safe and maybe I'll go someday. I'm going to be back again with another episode next week. So share this show with somebody you know. It really helps us grow and we'll see you soon.